Hello, my dears. My neighbor just started mowing his lawn. And also, I hated this lighting, but I kind of like it now, but maybe it won't even focus when I edit it and I'll be like, Sydney, you should have checked that before you filmed everything. Because that happens a lot, in case you haven't noticed. But anyway, so, we are entering the hot take era of my channel. Well, okay. We've been in the hot take era of my channel for a while, but I feel like my videos are more likely to be hot takes at this point than not at this point. I'm kind of rolling with it. I hope that it brings you joy as well. For those of you who are new here, hi, my name is Sydney. My pronouns are they, them. I am a white person with light brown curly hair that is curly, it's like shoulder length, and I'm wearing like a cream off the shoulder dress and a corset stays thing. I feel like I'm legally required to go do the tarantella in this outfit. I also have round glasses, and I study everything in the realm of disability, autism, theater, minority studies, psychology, sociology, media analysis, and I guess music. We talk about all of those things and some of those more than others on my channel. So if you want to stick around, you're welcome to subscribe. I am quite happy to have you here, but also if you don't want to, that's cool too. No pressure. Do what you will. Now, I don't want to be the kind of person who exclusively talks about their thesis, but the thing is, a large section of my thesis is the research that I am posting on my channel for you, because that is literally what I wrote in my proposal. I'm doing my research to teach other people, and so I'm gonna be that person who talks about their thesis all the time, but it's not voluntary, or it's kind of voluntary. Anyway, so in my research of late, specifically on the topics of disability aesthetics, which I will explain what those are in a hot second, I keep coming into discussions about the unique position of disability as a form of oppression. And I've spoken before about this on my channel, specifically in my performative activism video, but probably also elsewhere, because this is one of the things in the world that annoys me the absolute most, about how people talk about being activists and being inclusive and put lots of effort into focusing on racism and homophobia and sexism and maybe transphobia if we're lucky, but like that doesn't often happen, and ableism was just totally left out of that completely. Most activist events are horribly inaccessible. Many activists I know are open to absolutely everything until you confront them about ableism or inaccessibility, and then they just completely freeze up. And most spaces claim to be super welcoming until you need accommodations, and then suddenly you are not welcome, and also, why are you so needy? Now, at first I was vaguely convinced that because the minority identity about myself that I'm most aware of is my disabilities, I most readily notice that when that's discriminated against in comparison to other things. But then in conversations with other people in other minorities, and also having come out as trans, turns out I'm actually not making up this phenomenon, and many people feel like DEI tends to exclude disability, to which I've always wondered why, because like, it's not like disabled people are hard to find. We make up a fifth of the population. So the idea of, maybe they're not aware that disability exists in groups that are hyper aware of every other minority that makes up less the population, and their needs doesn't really check out. But now that I'm reading a truly horrifying amount of disability theory, I've learned that not only have leading researchers into the topic also noticed this phenomenon, but they've also explained it in a way that both makes so much sense, how have I never thought of that before, but also just completely changed how I look at the entire world, and it was a total, I was gonna say mind F word, but I don't swear on my channel, so it just, yeah, truly mind-bending. So today I'm going to share that knowledge with you so that you don't have to read some very clunky textbooks like I did. Also, I'm going to try to explain this in as straightforward and simply as I possibly can, but it is very philosophical, so if it takes you a bit to totally understand all these concepts, that is totally okay. There is no shame in that. I didn't understand this until the third textbook to mention it, so there's that for your reference. And also, that whole thing was probably a ramble. So let's just dive in. Now, the first thing to note is that disability and impairment are two different things definitionally. Obviously, they can overlap, but the distinction is very important. Impairment is defined as any loss or abnormality of psychological, physiological, or anatomical structure or function, while disability means any restriction or lack, often resulting from an impairment, not always, of ability to perform an activity in the manner or within the range considered normal for a human being. So for example, my chronic migraines are both a disability and an impairment. They're an impairment because when I have one, I can't drive and I often can't walk. Regardless of social norms and accessibility, they do get in the way of me being able to live the life how I want to live my life. They become a disability when they are triggered or made worse by lighting or inaccessibility or discrimination. Now, I count my happiness and other emotional things in a situation specifically on my average number of migraine days, and I found that the more discriminated against and miserable I am in a situation, the more sick I get. So if I'm pretty content and I feel safe, I'll have maybe 1 or 2 migraine days a month, usually caused by the occasional rainstorm or bad night's sleep, and if I don't feel safe or have my needs met, if I ask for accommodations and they're denied, etc., I could have up to 30 migraine days a month. So that's a thing. That is very rare for me at this point because I can now verbalize what my needs are, and also I have the Americans with Disabilities Act memorized and I'm not afraid to use it. I also know the Italian one, if you ever need it. I translated that for reasons. But anyway, issues are usually fixed pretty quickly for me at this point, and then it's mostly impairment only. But the other important thing to know is that you can be disabled without having any impairment, and that's kind of where this whole video comes in. The social model of disability basically says that the disabled people are only disabled because the world is inaccessible to us, otherwise we're just different. And that often expands to other minorities as well. For example, if a wheelchair user went into a building where the women's and men's restrooms were down or up a flight of stairs, they're disabled because they cannot do the stairs in order to pee. If a non-binary person went into the same building and also needed to pee, that is equally as inaccessible to them because they do not have a restroom that is inclusive to their gender. And if for some horrible reason there is a whites only sign outside of that theater, people of color are also equally disabled in this situation because they cannot enter the establishment altogether. Now, these minority people are discriminated against in a way that makes them disabled because they are restricted from being able to do something in the manner or within the range considered normal for a human being. Also, it should be noted that most of the time when somebody discriminates or is prejudiced against a disabled person, it's usually based on the belief, whether they're aware of that or not, that typical abilities are superior, because that's the definition of ableism. So, if you wanted to feel superior to somebody in a minority and justify that ethically to yourself, what are you gonna do? You're gonna pathologize it. You're gonna turn the minority identity into a disability. You say that women are all hysteric and mentally disabled and can't think properly. You use science to explain that people of other races are less evolved and therefore less intelligent and also have inferior biology. You say that immigrants are sick and poor. You say that poor people are mentally deficient and it's their fault that they're poor. You categorize queerness and transness as mental illnesses. I could go on. There are lots of examples of this. In history, 9 times out of 10, so-called inferior biology was used to justify the oppression of marginalized people. And as we talked about in my deep dive into the DSM, capitalism, and the non-existence of neurotypicality, the vast majority of these impairments don't exist to begin with. They're completely made up. They're just different from the norm. And in society, difference is usually seen as deviance, something negative and unnatural that needs to be fixed or avoided altogether. And I'm currently working on a video about the history of the American Freak Show that specifically is going to get into why we see atypical as unnatural. Spoiler alert, it's related to social Darwinism. But I have a 418-page book to start and finish before I can make that video, so just trust me on this one for right now. Now, I'm not saying that disability is the worst form of oppression or whatever, because first of all, no. Second of all, you cannot compare different forms of oppression. No. But when it comes to intersectionality, every form of oppression is intertwined, and we know that. And to quote my textbook, all oppressive systems function by reducing human variation to deviancy and inferiority defined on the mental and physical plane. Or, kind of the same thing, but also opposite. Physical or cognitive inferiority has historically characterized the means by which bodies have been constructed as deviant. And because of this, when minority groups try to be seen and perceived as equals in the general population, they tend to make themselves seem less deviant. That's how they handle it. So for example, a lot of the early gay rights movement was a whole, we're humans, just like you. We're the same people. We just love other people kind of thing. Many other minority populations have had their own ways of assimilating in history and in the present. And it does make sense that, like, in theory, that would minimize discrimination. They try to erase the stigma and be seen as just as good as the mainstream. And as movements grow and change, they kind of realize that you can't do that because no matter what you do, the mainstream is the one who determines and creates the stigma. So no matter how much you try to change yourself, that's not going to work. So rather than that, we try to change the perception of that stigma because we cannot change the stigma itself. So movements typically go from we're just like you narratives to we're different, and that's beautiful and important and valuable, and we need to be accepted as different narratives, which I think we've seen a lot of late. Also, from a social sciences perspective, that is actually a more effective form of transgression and of gaining power than the assimilation model, even if you do lose some acceptance along the way. But that was a lot of theory. So let's put this into a small scale logical example. The weird kid at school is left out of absolutely everything at school because they're the weird kid. So they try to be like everybody else so that people don't see them as the weird kid anymore. And it sorta kinda works, but not really. But then when they accept that they are the weird kid and they lean into that fact that they're the weird kid, they become confident in how weird they are, and that's when they gain the respect of other people, even if they are overall less likable, because the ones that do support them wholeheartedly. And also, they have more strength in themselves to fight things. And that's how society works too. But the thing is, as we mentioned earlier, in society, the people who are calling out the weird kids and being mean to them justify this behavior 9 times out of 10 by assigning the weird kid some innate natural defect. Kind of like how we were like, oh, the weird kid has cooties, we have to avoid them. Because if there's something fundamentally wrong with them, you can more easily convince yourself that, well, you're not that, so you feel less bad about yourself. Kind of like how people think that all bad people are mentally ill, and so therefore, oh, I'm not mentally ill, so I can't be a bad person. I must be a good person because I'm not mentally ill, despite every single piece of that argument being very sketchy at best because they're also probably mentally ill. And also, mental illness obviously does not mean being a bad person. So basically what this means is for minority groups to gain leverage in society, they typically do that by separating themselves from disability. Women will say that they are, in fact, of sound mind. The queer community was able to get homosexuality removed from the DSM. Gender dysphoria is still there. That's a conversation for another day. We created queer pride, Black is Beautiful campaigns exist, and I could go on. Obviously, these movements are purposefully going, oh, we should throw the disabled community under the bus in order to gain leverage over our own minority status at all, because that's not what's happening. But it is kind of what ends up happening. The thing that makes the disability minority unique is our impairment isn't entirely society only. Like, sure, universal accessibility would help a whole ton, and many disabled people would be less impaired, but disabled people will always be impaired on some level regardless of the situation. So we can't separate ourselves from impairment by saying, actually, we're not disabled, like other groups can, because we're disabled. So while we see all of these positivity differences, beautiful campaigns for other social minorities and marginalized people, disabilities have been blocked from access to similar political status. The category of disability, according to many of the most liberal advocates, represents an undesirable state of being that no political triage can repair. So let us unpack that statement a little bit. Specifically, that disability represents an undesirable state of being that no political triage can repair. Humans associate disability inherently with impairment, which makes sense, which we then associate impairment with isolation and loneliness, with the fear of losing control, because if you think about it, disability is one of very few minorities, if not the only, that you can one day just suddenly become a part of it. And as lifespans increase in society, the more elderly people with disabilities there are. And you could argue that the queer community also has a lot of latecomers to it, but that is usually more of a self-realization thing than like a, you just got diagnosed with a chronic illness kind of thing. That's a very different situation. And to quote the book Narrative Prosthesis, which is one of my textbooks, disability represents a powerful yet culturally uninterrogated conflict within the national psyche? Psych? I don't know. It is the site where the conflictual nature of our beliefs about viable lives gets acted out. The world of disability is one where you have to think about what constitutes a viable life, who should be left to live and who shouldn't, because it's very likely that a person might have an idea in their head of what a miserable life not worth living would look like to them, and then spend some time with the disabled community and find somebody living that exact life and doing so happily and not wanting anything to change. And that really frightens people for some reason. But the interesting thing is able-bodied people, and I'm gonna call them normits from now on. I've been using that interchangeably in other videos, but most of my textbooks call them normits. Normit being a version of the word normal, but without the connotation of good or bad. It just is the norm. It's like typicality, but easier to say, I don't know. And then there's also TAB or TAB, which stands for temporarily able-bodied. That one doesn't work as well in my brain, so I don't like it. But anyway, I digress. Normits are terrified of disability, whether they realize it or not, and yet they also, interestingly, crave it. Once you start looking and you know how to look for it, you'll realize that disability is absolutely everywhere in the media. In fact, since 1989, 50% of actors who won the Oscar for Best Actor won for being non-disabled actors who played disabled roles. I do media analyses of autism, disability, and memory loss on my various social medias. I also just got a TikTok. And the list of things that I want to review is absolutely massive and ever-growing because I keep finding things. And this isn't like an, oh, people just want more representation these days, because half of these crazy amounts of representation are from the early 1900s, and we're going to get into the Victorian fascination with disability another time, but what I'm trying to say is that in real life, everybody avoids disability as much as possible, but once it's safely in art, or on a screen, or in a book, safely on display for us to stare at from a distance, we don't need to worry that maybe it'll cross into reality. And that's also why cripface, which is non-disabled actors playing disabled characters, is so normalized in society, because people like to see a disabled character where the disability is something that that person can then take off at the end of the day, because that makes them feel like in the event of their sudden disabling, they too would be able to just take it off like a coat and live normally. It's truly baffling. I find it fascinating. But where it gets weirder is that when you dip into the world of disability aesthetics, when it comes to artwork, humans, etc. I keep saying humans as if I'm also not a human being. Conspiracy theory, Sydney's an alien. You heard it here, kids. In artwork, we find perfection boring and unnerving, and the characters that we most enjoy are the broken ones, those with missing pieces. For example, one of the most famous works of art is the Venus de Milo? One of the two! A statue with no arms. And if you saw the same statue with arms, it wouldn't really stand out or even be particularly interesting. My computer's telling me I need to back it up. Not the time, babe! In art restoration, when artists work to restore a work after damage, they purposefully make their changes reversible or easily viewable and don't try to make it a perfect fix because the piece has authenticity in its errors and idiosyncrasies. Aesthetics, just like as a thing, are the involuntary sensations and or emotional response some bodies feel in the presence of other bodies, often with the other bodies being an inanimate object, but not always. So, for example, the reason that you find a painting aesthetically pleasing is because it makes you feel nice inside, and you often don't have control over whether it makes you feel nice inside or not, though that can change if you associate it with something else that makes you feel nice inside. And typically, when we find something aesthetic or not, that's tied directly to whether it's accepted or rejected. An example being if you go to an animal shelter and there are two puppies and your brain creates an involuntary emotional response to both of those puppies, telling you that one is very cute and one is very ugly, you are significantly more likely to reject the one that you saw as not aesthetic. Unless you like the brokenness that you see and you feel a kinship with the ugly one because you also feel the same way and then you get that one instead, if that makes any sense. And our brains use aesthetics to judge pretty much everything. That's why somebody with a more pleasing or aesthetic or palatable disability, even though that is a really disgusting and gross way to phrase that, but it's honest, will usually get more support and care from people in comparison to another disabled person, which is so important to be aware of because an understanding of these aesthetics and how they work reveals the operative principles of disqualification used in minority oppression. So back to our main point, disabled people discrimination, diversity, equity, and inclusion were not included in this often because the idea of disability scares people, but we also like to see it safely in art or on screen so that we can ogle at it. But when we're confronted with it in person, it often sets off aesthetic alarm bells that cause us to automatically reject it. And if you're thinking, this connects to pretty privilege and why white Eurocentric features have privilege. Yes, precisely. If you look a certain way in society, you hit the positive feeling aesthetics and you're in the in-group. But since people don't want to seem shallow about that, they pretend that they don't like other people because they're biologically inferior. Hence the artificial creation of impairment in minorities in order to rationalize their own disqualification of those minorities from society, which the minorities try to escape from in order to gain social currency by separating themselves from said stigmatization as disabled, which then furthers the idea that impairment is inherently terrible, which then further alienates the disabled community. But the reason that we're talking about this today is, well, it's partially for y'all to see how all oppression is connected, because when I learned about this, it, as I said earlier, kind of blew my mind and it made me look at the world very differently. But it's also a really great time for us to use these same principles and this same model of looking at the world to analyze and kindly call out some interesting separations in the queer community, the disabled community, and the autistic community. Now, the first, more obvious one is the queer community. The trans community, which is within the queer community, because there's a T in LGBTQ+, is often separated from the wider queer community. And why? Well, because trans people, especially those in the gender non-conforming category, by definition challenge gender norms and, in general, aesthetics. So we are, to put it lightly, less palatable to the general public. So often in our history, in queer history in general, we've made the most noise because we are the most noticeable and the most at risk in the community. However, people who are concerned about gaining rights for the queer community often just kind of pretend that trans people don't exist because it's easier for queer people to assimilate and minimize stigma without us. Which I guess in the short term logically does make a tiny bit of sense, but also specifically trans women of color are the reason we have most of our rights. So let's be decent human beings and support everybody in their needs. And also if we keep splintering up, it's just going to be hard for everybody to get rights because minority groups inevitably stomp on each other in order to get access and rights. And that's, you know, not ideal. You will also probably notice that historically the disability rights movement has more or less separated itself from people with intellectual and developmental disabilities because physical disabilities are often more palatable and more easily normalized, that's a word, yes, and easily explainable and understandable, and thus for survival the movement has split. In recent years it's been working to unify, to include those with IDs. We've made a lot of progress, and we still have a very long way to go. But when I read all of these things, my mind immediately jumped to the current state of the neurodivergent movement in relation to the disability movement, and also just within its own movement. We push the idea of we're only disabled because of capitalism very hard, and yes, that is true. Having a perfectly accessible world would make a lot of people less disabled and less impaired. Getting rid of capitalism and racism and other systems of oppression, it's not going to make somebody with executive dysfunction so bad that they can't eat half the time suddenly not impaired by that. Because yes, if they have the right supports in place and they don't have to fight to get a job in order to survive, despite their executive dysfunction getting in the way of that, it will be easier for them to manage and to handle, but to them, it may still feel like an impairment and disability, and that is okay. And I should also note that a fully accessible world is impossible because conflicting access needs are so very common, and also disabled people do make up a fifth of the population. So we can only hope to be more accessible and inclusive, but one of the core tenets of, like, in the world of disability and accessible education, is that that is impossible, and we acknowledge that. So just want to throw that one out there. What I'm trying to say is that all of this work and movement towards we are not impaired, we are unique narratives silences the people who are impaired and the people who do feel impaired and experience impairment. And you can feel impaired and not be miserable. And I know that that's really hard to wrap your mind around, but it is true. And this separation of neurotype from disability, while it is an important discussion to have, it's very reductionist and inevitably separates neurodivergent people from other disabled people, and it continues to, whether we mean to or not, put down disability and impairment as bad words, and impairment specifically as something absolutely terrible that must be abolished and avoided at all costs, which is just not possible or realistic, and also ethically very sketchy. We're dipping into eugenics territory. So I feel like this whole video has been a bit of a convoluted mess of theory and disorganized points, so I truly hope that it made any sense. But the general goal of it is to make you realize that my left foot is so numb right now, but also that internal ideas of impairment is inherently and fundamentally wrong. No matter how we feel about disability or race or sexuality or gender or anything else, these ideas affect how we interact with the world and with other minorities. And we need to be careful to not use that in combination with our involuntary aesthetic judgments to disqualify people from the world, which sounds like well, of course I wouldn't do that thing. But then once you start paying attention to how you view the world, you're gonna catch yourself doing it way more often than you would like to think. Like, this really has been throwing me for a loop the past, week or so, but in a good way. And this is also why I obviously encourage critical thinking and challenging the world around you, because that's how we find these things, and that's how we learn to be better and more intersectional and accessible and kind human beings. So, I hope that you learned something today. I hope this video made some semblance of sense. I will link my sources in the description if you want to check them out. The textbooks aren't horribly boring, so they're decent. Also, if you want to see what textbooks I'm reading, I've been reviewing all of my textbooks on my Instagram story, so you can follow me on Instagram. I will link that in the description for you as well. And obviously, please make sure that your DEI includes disability and also includes trans people, and also please protect trans kids, because we really need it right now. And as always, thank you for listening. Thank you for learning. Remember, it is never too late to start over, and I look forward to seeing you, my dear, in the next one.